Well, Miss Hartwell, since not one of these charming young ladies will have me and I am plainly doomed to die a bachelor, perhaps I had better marry you. What do you say? Will you take pity on a poor rejected duke? Julian Ashford, 6th Duke of Denimore, said it laughing over his shoulder, to the room at large. A careless, glittering thing flung out to amuse the drawing-room after a long game of forfeits had ended, as such games did, with the beautiful Mrs. Fairfax pretending to refuse him and everyone laughing. He said it to Prudence Hartwell because she happened to be nearest, the way one addresses a joke to the nearest convenient person. She was the companion to old Lady Denimore, his grandmother, a quiet woman of some 27 who sat always a little apart with her mending, whom nobody ever looked at twice, and whom Julian, if he was honest, had scarcely looked at once in the 3 months she had lived under his grandmother's wing. He expected her to blush and stammer and say nothing, as overlooked women did when a duke made them the butt of a jest. He had already half turned back to the Fairfax girls, the words barely out of his mouth, the laugh not yet faded from the room. "I thought you'd never ask," said Prudence Hartwell. She said it quietly, but the room heard it, because a room always hears the thing it is not expecting. She said it looking up from her mending, perfectly composed, her needle paused in the cloth, her plain face lifted to his with an expression he could not read at all, not blushing, not stammering, not the least bit flustered. She said it as though she had been waiting for the question a long time and was only relieved it had finally come. The laughter died. The Fairfax girls exchanged a glance. Lady Denimore in her chair by the fire went very still, and something moved behind her old shrewd eyes that Julian, had he been attending, might have found alarming. And Julian Ashford stood in the middle of his grandmother's drawing-room with a joke curdling on his lips, and discovered that he did not know what to say. He began. "You asked me to marry you," Prudence said, calmly setting down her mending. "Before all these witnesses, I have accepted. I am aware, your grace, that you meant it as a jest, you meant it as you mean most things lightly to amuse the room, and I am aware that the honorable course now is for me to laugh it off and let you off the hook, and spare you the awkwardness of having proposed to your grandmother's companion by accident." She stood, smoothing her plain skirts. "But I find I do not wish to. I have spent 27 years being the person who laughs things off to spare gentlemen their awkwardness, and I have decided, quite recently and quite firmly, that I have done it for the last time. So, you have asked me and I have said yes, and I shall hold you to it, or you shall have to be the one to cry off and be known throughout the county as the duke who jilted his grandmother's companion. I leave the choice entirely to you. Good evening." And she curtsied to the room, to the astonished Fairfax girls, to the frozen duke, to Lady Denimore, whose old face had cracked into something suspiciously like a smile, and she walked out with her head high and her mending under her arm, leaving behind her a silence so complete that Julian could hear the fire settle in the grate. "Well," said Lady Denimore into the silence, with enormous satisfaction, "that is the most interesting thing that has happened in this drawing-room in 40 years. Julian, do close your mouth. You look like a landed trout." Julian closed his mouth. The Fairfax girls, sensing that the evening's entertainment had taken a turn beyond their competence, made their excuses and fled, and their mother with them, no doubt to spread the story across 3 counties by breakfast. And Julian was left alone with his grandmother, who was regarding him over her spectacles with the particular relish of a very old woman watching a very young man reap what he has carelessly sown. "You will have to marry her, you know," Lady Denimore observed. "Grandmother, it was a jest. The whole room knows it was a jest. The whole room knows you proposed to a gentlewoman in company, and she accepted you. That is what the whole room knows, and that is what the whole room will say, and by Thursday it will be in every drawing-room from here to London that the Duke of Denimore is engaged to his grandmother's companion. You may, of course, deny it. You may announce that you were only amusing yourself at the expense of a poor woman with no fortune and no family, that you never meant a word of it, that the whole thing was a joke and she was a fool to take it seriously." The old lady's voice was mild and merciless. "That is entirely within your power. It will ruin her, of course. A woman jilted so publicly does not easily find another place. Who engages a companion the Duke of Denimore was heard to trifle with. But that need not trouble you. It was only a jest. Julian sat down rather heavily. You are enjoying this. I am enjoying it enormously. I have been trying to get you to look at that girl for 3 months, and you never once did, because she does not giggle and she has no fortune, and she does not throw herself at your head like the Mrs. Fairfax, whom you find so amusing and would be miserable married to within a 12-month. Lady Denimore set down her cup. Now, sit there and listen to an old woman, because I shall not live forever, and you had much better hear this while I am still here to say it. You have spent your whole life being amused. You are charming and clever and rich, and everyone has laughed at your jokes since you were in leading strings, and you have never in your life had to be in earnest about anything, because charm has always been enough. That girl who just walked out of here has been in earnest every day of her life, because she has had to be. She has no fortune to be careless with, no name to trade on, nothing but her own steadiness, and she has just done the bravest thing I have seen a woman do in years. She has called your bluff publicly at enormous risk to herself, because she is tired of being invisible, and she has decided, quite rightly, that she would rather be ruined standing up than safe on her knees. You may destroy her or you may deserve her. I am curious to see which you choose. I have, I confess, my suspicions. Julian did not sleep that night either. He lay awake in the great ducal bed and turned the evening over, and the thing that would not let him rest was not the awkwardness, nor the county gossip, nor even his grandmother's needling. It was the look on Prudence Hartwell's face when she had said, "I thought you'd never ask," that composed, waiting, unflustered look. The look of a woman who had thought about this before, who had perhaps watched him for 3 months across a drawing-room and formed opinions she had never once been asked for, and who had seized a careless joke and turned it into a door and walked straight through it because she had decided her life was worth the gamble. He had never once wondered what Prudence Hartwell thought. He had never wondered whether she thought at all. And now he found he could think of nothing else, and it was a novel and uncomfortable sensation for a man who had spent 30 years being the most interesting person in every room he entered, to discover that the most interesting person in this one had been sitting in the corner with her mending the whole while, unregarded, waiting. He found her in the morning in the small parlor, writing letters. She looked up when he came in, and her face gave nothing away, and he understood that she had spent the night not knowing whether she had won her whole future or destroyed it, and had gone on writing her letters regardless, because that was the kind of woman she was. "You have come to cry off," she said. "It was not a question. I quite understand. I gambled and I have lost. You need only say the word and I shall release you and be gone by evening, and you may tell the county whatever pleases you. I ask only that you let me keep my character with your grandmother, who has been kind to me, so that I may find another situation. That is all." "I have not come to cry off," Julian said, and was surprised to hear himself say it, and more surprised to find it true. "I have come to, I hardly know. To find out who you are, I think. I proposed to you last night without the faintest idea of it, and it appears I am engaged to a stranger, and it seems only prudent to become acquainted with the woman I am to marry." Prudence set down her pen. Something flickered across her plain, composed face, not hope. She was too guarded for hope, but a wary, careful attention. "You cannot mean to go through with it." "I do not know what I mean. That is the difficulty. I am not accustomed to not knowing what I mean. I have always known. The knowing has always been easy and cheap, and it has never cost me anything, and last night, for the first time in my life, I said a thing and could not tell whether I meant it, and I have not been able to think of anything else since." He came and sat across from her, uninvited, which was not his habit. "So, Miss Hartwell, tell me who you are, not the companion, the person. My grandmother says I have never once looked at you, and she is right, and I am ashamed of it, and I should like to begin." And so she told him over that morning, and the many that followed, for Julian found reasons to seek her out now, the way he had never sought out anyone. She was the daughter of a clergyman, well-born but poor, orphaned at 20 and left with nothing but a good education and a small trunk of books. She had been a governess and then a companion. passed from household to household, useful and invisible, watching genteel families live their genteel lives from the edge of the room, never quite of any of them. She was clever, far cleverer than the drawing-room had ever suspected, and she was funny, dryly, in a way that took him entirely by surprise, so that he found himself laughing at her wit instead of his own, which had never once happened to him in his life. She read everything. She had opinions on everything and had learned to keep them to herself, because a companion with opinions does not keep her place long, and Julian, drawing them out one by one, found each one sharper and truer and more delightful than the last. He had proposed to her as a joke because she was the nearest overlooked woman to hand. He discovered, week by week, that she was not overlooked because there was nothing to see. She was overlooked because no one had ever troubled to look, and the not looking had been the whole world's loss, and it had very nearly been his. "You watched me for 3 months," he said one afternoon. They were walking in his grandmother's garden. It had become their habit. "Before the joke, my grandmother said you had formed opinions of me. I should like to hear them. I warn you I am braced for the worst." Prudence considered him. "You wish the truth." "I find I wish the truth from you more than I have ever wished it from anyone. It is most inconvenient." "Very well." She stopped by the roses. "I thought when I first came that you were exactly what you appeared, charming and idle and pleased with yourself, a man to whom nothing had ever been difficult, who had never in his life said a serious word. I thought you would break the Fairfax girls' hearts one by one without noticing, and I disliked you rather for being so careless with people, though of course I said nothing, because companions say nothing." She paused. "Then I watched longer because I had nothing to do in that drawing-room but watch, and I saw the other thing. I saw you sit for an hour with your grandmother when she was low, and make her laugh, and never tell anyone you had done it. I saw you notice the footman's hand was bandaged and quietly send him to rest. I saw that under all the charm there was a man who was kind when he thought no one was looking, and who had never once been asked to be anything more than charming, and I thought—" She stopped. "You thought," Julian said very quietly. "I thought it was a great waste," Prudence said. "I thought, there is a good man in there who has never had to become himself because no one ever required it of him, and no one ever will because everyone lets a duke stay a boy forever. And then last night you made your careless joke, and I thought quite suddenly and quite recklessly, and I still cannot entirely account for it, I thought, I shall require it of him. I shall call his bluff and see whether the good man comes out. It was a terrible risk and a worse presumption, and I fully expected to be ruined for it." She looked up at him, and her guarded face was, for once, entirely open. "But you did not cry off. You came to the parlor to find out who I was, so perhaps I was not wrong about the good man after all." The engagement, having begun as a jest and been seized as a gamble, now had to be lived through in the awkward, exhilarating daylight of an ordinary courtship. For the county fully believed the Duke of Denimore engaged, and there could be no undoing it without ruin to Prudence. And so the two of them were thrown together, day upon day, in the peculiar position of a betrothed couple who had never so much as chosen each other, learning in public the things most couples learn in private, or not at all. Julian found it the strangest and most agreeable education of his life. He had been engaged before briefly, at 23, to a beauty who had thrown him over for a marquis, and he had minded chiefly the dent to his vanity. He had flirted his way through a decade of seasons and never once been in earnest, because earnestness was for men who could not manage charm, and Julian could always manage charm. And now here he was, walking in the garden every afternoon with a plain, penniless companion who would not be charmed, who saw through his charm as through clean glass, and told him so, and liked him better for the man underneath it than for the glitter on top, which no one had ever done in his life. "You do that when you are uncomfortable," she observed one afternoon. They were in the long gallery, sheltering from the rain. He had just turned a serious question of hers aside with a witticism, as was his habit. "You make a joke. Whenever a thing comes too near, you reach for something clever and hold it up in front of you like a fan. I have watched you do it 100 times. You did it just now." Julian stopped. "Did I?" You did. I asked whether you were happy truly as a man, not as a duke, and you told me a very amusing thing about your tailor, and it was very amusing, and it was also a fan, and I saw straight through it, as I generally do. She was not unkind. She said it the way she said everything, plainly as a fact worth knowing. You need not do it with me, Julian. I am not one of the drawing room. I do not require to be amused. You may simply answer the question, or say you had rather not answer it, and either will do. But the fan is unnecessary. I have already seen what is behind it, and it is a great deal better than the fan. Julian looked at her for a long moment. The rain ran down the tall gallery windows. The portraits of dead Denimores looked down, none of them, he suspected, having ever been asked whether they were happy either. No, he said at last. I am not happy. I have not been happy in a long while, and I did not know it, because no one ever asks a duke whether he is happy. They ask whether he is amused, and I am always amused, and I mistook the one for the other for about 10 years. He said it slowly, feeling his way, for he was not practiced at saying true things without a fan. I have everything a man is supposed to want, and I have been bored to the bone by all of it, and I have hidden the boredom behind being charming, and everyone has been so pleased by the charm that no one noticed the man behind it was slowly turning to glass. You noticed. From a corner with your mending in 3 months, you noticed a thing my own grandmother took 40 years to see. That is why I did not cry off, Prudence. Not to spare you, to spare myself. Because the morning after the joke, I woke up and realized that, for the first time in a decade, I was not bored, and I was not going to give that up for the sake of a little awkwardness with the Fairfax girls. Prudence was very still. That is the truest thing you have ever said to me. It is the truest thing I have ever said to anyone. You have a way of getting them out of me. It is most disconcerting. I begin to think I shall spend my whole life telling you true things, and I find, to my very great surprise, that I should like nothing better. She turned away then to the window, and he saw her hand go briefly to her eyes, and he understood, for he was learning to read her, as she had long ago learned to read him, that she was overcome, and did not wish him to see it, and needed a moment. He gave it to her. He had learned that, too, from watching her give it to his grandmother, to the footman, to everyone whose dignity she quietly protected, the art of not looking at the right moment. He turned to the nearest portrait and remarked upon its remarkable ugliness until she had command of herself again, and she was grateful, and he knew she was grateful, and neither of them said so, which was its own kind of intimacy. But there was one shadow across those bright weeks, and it came, as such shadows do, from the world outside. The story had spread, as Lady Denimore had foretold, to every drawing-room in 3 counties. The Duke of Denimore engaged to his grandmother's companion, a penniless nobody, a woman of no family. And the county, which loves nothing so well as a great match unless it be the spoiling of one, had begun to talk not kindly. There were those who said Miss Hartwell had trapped him, that she had turned a careless jest into a betrothal by sheer effrontery, that a companion who would do such a thing was no better than an adventuress, and the Duke a fool to be caught so. The whispers reached Prudence as whispers do. She was too clever not to hear them, and too proud to complain of them, and Julian, who might not have noticed at all in his old careless days, noticed now, because he had learned to watch her, and saw the whispers land, and saw her bear them in silence, and found he could not bear them for her. "They are saying I trapped you," she told him at last, when he pressed her, for she would not have volunteered it. "That I am an adventuress, that you are a fool. I do not mind for myself, I have been talked of before and worse. But I mind for you, Julian. You have a name to lose, and I am the cause of its being spoken slightingly, and that I do mind very much." Julian was quiet a moment, and then he smiled, but it was not the careless, glittering smile. It was something harder and warmer and entirely new. "Then we had better give the county something else to talk of," he said. "Leave it to me, Prudence. I have spent 30 years learning how to command a room. It is nearly the only useful thing I know how to do, and I have never once had a reason worth doing it for. I have one now." And give the county something else to talk of, he did, though not in the way the county expected. There was to be a great dinner at Denimore the following week, the first Julian had hosted in years, and the whole neighborhood came, half of them out of curiosity to see the adventurous companion who had trapped a duke, and half out of the simpler wish to dine well at ducal expense. They came prepared to be superior. They found themselves, over the course of a single evening, comprehensively outmaneuvered, not by any grand gesture, but by the quiet, deadly competence of a woman who had spent 27 years watching genteel society from its edges and knew its every weakness better than it knew itself. For Prudence, seated at the foot of the long table as its mistress for the first time, was magnificent in the only way that truly counts in such a room. She was interested in everyone and remembered everything, and had the great rare gift of making each person she spoke to feel briefly like the cleverest soul in England. The dowager who had come to sneer found herself charmed into telling the story of her own girlhood, which no one had asked to hear in 30 years. The stiff-necked squire who had called Prudence an adventuress at his own breakfast table discovered she had read his favorite treatise on drainage and had shrewd opinions on it, and went home her devoted partisan. And Julian, watching from the head of the table, saw the whole room turn, course by course, from suspicion to grudging respect to open delight, and understood that he had done nothing at all, that his cleverest stroke had simply been to put Prudence Hartwell in the mistress's chair, and let the county discover for itself what he had discovered in the garden, that she was, quite without trying, the most compelling person any of them had ever met. "You did not need me to command the room after all," he murmured to her, when the guests had gone and the candles burned low. "You did it yourself, and never raised your voice, and half of them will be quoting you by Sunday. I am beginning to think, Prudence, that I have got very much the better of this bargain, and that the county, which pities me for marrying a nobody, has the matter precisely upside down." "They will come round," Prudence said, but she was smiling, a rare, unguarded, tired, happy smile. "They always come round in time to whatever the Duke does. It is the one genuine advantage of your rank, and I intend to make thorough use of it." "You are going to be a formidable duchess." "I am going to be a very formidable duchess," she agreed. "You have been warned. It is far too late to cry off." "I would not cry off," Julian said, "for the whole of England," and meant it, as he had learned at last to mean everything. Julian Ashford stood among his grandmother's roses and looked at Prudence Hartwell, and understood that somewhere in the weeks since a careless joke, without his marking the day, the thing he had said without meaning had become the thing he meant more than anything he had ever said in earnest. "You were not wrong about the good man," he said slowly. "Though I think you give me too much credit, the good man had been asleep a very long time, and it took a companion with a needle and a great deal of nerve to wake him. Prudence, may I call you Prudence? I have been calling you it in my head for a fortnight, and it seems absurd to go on with Miss Hartwell Prudence. I owe you a confession, and it is not an easy one for a man who has never in his life had to be in earnest, so you must be patient with me while I make it badly. I have watched you make speeches to whole drawing-rooms without a single stumble," she said. "This should be nothing to you." "That is precisely the trouble. Those speeches cost me nothing. This one cost me a great deal, which is how I know it is true." He took a breath. "I proposed to you as a joke. You know that, the whole room knew it. It was thoughtless and unkind, and exactly the sort of careless thing my grandmother says I have done all my life. And then you said I thought you'd never ask, and something in me, Prudence, I have been trying for a fortnight to name it, and the nearest I can come is this. It was as though I had been playing at cards my whole life for counters, for nothing, for the amusement of the table, and quite by accident I had put down a real coin and looked up, and found that this time the game was real. I did not know it was real until you made it real." And now his voice was not quite steady, which astonished him. Nothing had ever made his voice unsteady. "Now I find that I do not want to be let off the hook. I have spent the fortnight dreading that you would grow tired of my company and release me, because I have discovered that I would rather be held to a joke with you than be free with anyone else in England. That is not a jest, Prudence. I have never meant anything less as a jest in my life." Prudence Hartwell stood very still among the roses. The wary guardedness that had armored her for 27 years wavered, and beneath it he saw, for the first time, how much the gamble had cost her, how frightened she had been, all this while, under the composure. How she had steeled herself every morning for the crying off that would ruin her, and had gone on writing her letters anyway. "You had better be quite sure, Your Grace," she said, and now her voice was unsteady too. "Because I called your bluff once at a terrible risk, and I would not survive doing it twice. If you are only being kind, if this is only charm wearing the clothes of earnest to spare us both the awkwardness, then cry off now, and let me go, and be careless with someone who can afford it. But do not tell me you are in earnest unless you are, because I have believed a man before, and I told you I have laughed things off to spare gentlemen their feelings for the last time. I meant that too." "I am not being kind," Julian said. "Ask my grandmother. She will tell you I have never been kind at any real cost to myself until this fortnight, and that the change in me is entirely your doing, and that she takes full credit for having thrown us together, which she does not deserve, because she only threw us into the same room. You did the rest, with a needle and a piece of mending and more courage than I have shown in 30 years. He went down, then, the Duke of Denimore on one knee in his grandmother's rose garden, before his grandmother's companion, with no room to perform to and no joke to hide behind. "Prudence Hartwell, I asked you once as a jest, and you were brave enough to take it seriously. Let me ask you now as the most serious thing I have ever done. Will you marry me, not to save your character, not to spare me the county's tongues, but because I have fallen in love with the person no one ever troubled to look at, and I intend to spend my life making certain she is looked at, and treasured, and never again invisible for as long as I live? I have never been more in earnest. I did not know, until you, that I could be." For a long moment Prudence did not answer. 2 tears slipped down her plain, composed face, and she did not wipe them away, and Julian understood that they were not tears of grief, but the overflow of a hope held down so long and so hard that its sudden release could only come out as weeping. "You foolish, careless, charming man," she said, exactly as his grandmother might have. "I said yes a fortnight ago before witnesses, and I have been terrified every day since that I should have to unsay it. Of course I will marry you. I thought you'd never ask properly, I mean this time. Now do get up off the ground. You will ruin your knees, and a duke on his knees among the roses is a very undignified spectacle, and I mean to be a most dignified duchess." Julian rose, laughing, but it was a different laugh than the careless, glittering one that had begun all this, a laugh with the whole weight of a man's heart behind it, and he took both her hands and drew her close, and for once in his charmed and careless life, the Duke of Denimore had nothing clever to say, and did not need it, and was glad. They were married in the autumn, and the county, which had begun by whispering that the Duke of Denimore had made a fool of himself over a penniless companion, ended by declaring the new Duchess the cleverest and most agreeable woman in 3 shires for Prudence Hartwell. Once she was looked at, proved impossible to overlook, and Julian took a private, endless delight in watching the very drawing-rooms that had never once noticed her now compete to sit beside her. Old Lady Denimore took credit for the match until the day she died, which was many contented years off, and no one troubled to correct her. And Julian Ashford, who had proposed to the overlooked woman as a careless joke, and discovered in her the one earnest thing his whole charmed life had lacked, kept all their years together, one private ritual he never explained to anyone. On the anniversary of that first evening every year, he would find her wherever she was in the great house, and bow, and say with mock gravity, "Miss Hartwell, since no one else will have me, perhaps I had better marry you." And every year Prudence would look up from whatever she was doing, composed and unflustered and entirely, permanently his, and answer, "I thought you'd never ask," and mean it, as he had learned at last to mean everything, exactly as much the 10th time as the first.